And think about the Jewish history. We're always telling stories. Think about Passover. We're telling stories. And we need to hear stories from our relatives, and we need to know the stories of our culture and our communities so we can share them with the next generation. So, Dorothy and I we took a workshop on how to tell a story. And from that, we've developed stories that we're going to share with you. And we took some of our ideas from the timeline.
I'm in the wrong place. That's why you don't know me on the list. Does that matter? I can stay. No. Should I go to the...
No, you're not obligated. You're not obligated to go anywhere.
Okay.
But you can vote with your feet.
Then I'm going to... I didn't sign up for this one, but I'm going to stay.
Okay. No, good. Thank you. The reason I know everybody else is because I know them, not because they signed up.
Okay.
I know them. Some I've known much longer than others. Do you want to add anything to the introduction?
Again, when you talk about Jewish history, it's all stories. No one knew anything much until it get to the point of Moshe, where he learned how to write of the Egyptians, and then suddenly we started documentation. But everything before that was stories carried down. And even though those stories continued to depict Jewish life, and in a sense became a part of Torah and who we are today, Torah is still being written. And though technically it's not being written in the Tanakh or the Torah, it's being written in the hearts of our kids. And one of the reasons why we're here today is not only to bring enlightenment to the Jewish timeline that we have, but we're pulling aspects out and creating stories, and we're asking you as parents and as grandparents and as aunts and uncles to also be able to put your stories together so that you can also translate that story to the next generation so that they too will continue what our Jewish forefathers actually started. So what Wendy's going to do is she's going to kind of take you down slowly through her timeline, and then I'll jump in, and then I'll tell my story. In a sense, it's filled with Jewish folklore, and then after that, Wendy will come back and we'll have a wrap up before you get to your next session.
And I'll tell my story. And the reason we're kind of loose right now with this introduction, because unfortunately the third member of our team couldn't make it today. She sends her regrets, but some emergency came up. It was Diane Aronson. So. Also, I want to add the stories we tell are stories not only, there are really two parts to it. One part is about our community, and another story is about our personal story. So we try and tie them together for you. All right, so meanwhile, let's look at this timeline, because this is a general story of our culture. Has anybody seen the timeline and had, Margo, you've seen it. You've seen it, but you've seen it too? Okay, but you haven't, okay. Meanwhile, I'm Wendy Davis, I've seen Ritual, and this is Dorothy
Hellman. Hi.
The timeline is divided into multiple sections. The very top on the loose site divides the timeline into periods of Jewish history. Then in the beige color, you see gray writing and maroon writing, letters. This tells us about general history, with the Jewish history in the maroon and the world history in the other color. And it's really nice to see how they juxtapose. So for example, we never think about the Great Wall of China being built just before the kingdom of Judah falls to Babylonia. So it's interesting just to see how everything ties together here. What the timeline also has is this major section here, where the different teachers of our congregation have pulled out different parts of history that they thought were important enough to illustrate. Now, what we have here to illustrate, we have some original drawings, such as this lady at the well. We have reproductions of famous artists, like this is Solomon, and it was done by Arthur Schick. We have maps. We have reproductions of things in our collection here. So we actually have this lithograph, and it shows
the diaspora, with Jerusalem in the middle, and then diaspora goes to Europe, Asia, and Africa. This goes back to like the 1500s, so it's an old map. Some are artifacts that our congregants have given to us. For example, this piece right here was given to the museum by, Taylor. Isaac Taylor, thank you, I couldn't think of his first name. So it's from him. The objects here are from Rabbi Goldman's collection. And Barry Gitlin, who is our resident archaeologist, has dated them for us, and they go back to Jeffrey Wentz McNay.
During the First Iron Age.
The First Iron Age, okay, thank you. All right, so what we're going to do though, really, what we want to do is really tell our story, but I wanted to give you a background. We're going to walk through this very quickly. I'm just going to point out some highlights quickly, and if you want more detail, please call Susan Vick, and she will set up a time where you can come and really see the timeline in detail.
Does she do like tour timeline, like a group tour if I call and say
Sure.
I have 10
Yes.
people?
Yes, please
Okay.
call.
Okay.
She'd love to do that. All right, let's walk.
Can I leave my stuff here?
Yes,
Oh,
yeah.
absolutely.
Absolutely. Trip over any. Out of the way. So I'm not going to point out any specifics right now. I'm just going to walk through. I mean, this talks about the diaspora into Babylonia, and then the Second Temple period. As we go through, now we go into the period where the Muslims are starting to populate the world, and how their culture has influenced the Jews, where we're now doing poetry, we're bringing rhyme into our liturgy. And then we keep going down into the diaspora, into Europe, and when you have a chance, you can come look in here. It talks about the Middle Ages and how the Jews are related to the church, the state, and the other religions. We have a sample here that's from the Geniza in Cairo, and it dates back to this period. Yes, it's a replication because the original is too valuable to put out, but we have it in the collection here. But then we just move down until we're in the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Kabbalah. And this is, now we have music in Italy. In fact, Chazan Perlman is going to be doing a concert shortly using the music from Italy. We have costumes that show what the people wore. Now we're entering into the Emancipation period, where Jews are now leaving their tight-knit communities and they're being allowed to go out into the general world. And we have people coming to America now too. And I know you want to stop and you want to look at all this in detail. Unfortunately, this is not the time for it. But maybe if there's time after the session, maybe if we're finished early, you can have an opportunity to come back and see this. Hello. Sure. I guess we're going to be, okay, here some of this is, when you have a chance, we have boxes here from the Civil, with correspondence from the Civil War. Jews participated in the Civil War, so we have a blue box, so you think this is about the Jews who participated in the Union, letters from people who participated in the South. But meanwhile, we're coming back. We're still going through the beginning of modernity now into the 1800s. And from here, we end up, for this one wall, this has to do with the Holocaust. And then around the corner, we go into modern history.
So we're going to ask you guys to come down here and take a seat. And while you're doing that, and your eyes are trailing there, I'm going to walk you through the story of the tribe from Uganda. And again, this is where stories become very powerful. And what you see here, when you're in a synagogue, you're being taught from this Torah every single day, and it becomes the norm for you. But what about others who simply hear and yet believe? It's an interesting concept. And there is the story of this group of Ugandans that are living over in Uganda, the Abayatuya tribe. And in the 1800s, 1880s, the British came and conquered. And when they did, what did they do? They brought Christianity with them. But there was a group who read the Bible, understood the Bible, but then they got the stories. And this is what they got. As subsistence farmers, as they're nomadic, they understood the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They understood Joseph when he said, I have my dreams, and the sun and the moon and the stars. They got that. And this tribe, not having any other affiliation except Christianity, suddenly took the Bible and said, listen, we're going to take the first part of the Bible. You can take the second. Because we want to follow the God of Avraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. What a concept. But it's a true concept. And in learning more about this Christianity as to what was presented, they found themselves drawn to the Jewish God. They started practicing the Shabbat. They started practicing farming in accordance to what they could get from, again, the Bible that they were reading at that particular time. And the British weren't very happy. So what does the British do? Pretty much they said, you need to stick with Christianity, or if not, then you're going to be Jewish. This tribe was very strong with regards to who they were and who they wanted to be. And the leader stood out, circumcised his kids, pretty much like Abraham that you saw with a staff, put it to the ground, and said, by God, we'll be Jewish. That is profound. And it's easy when you hear, and you're hearing it all the time, and you can relate to your kids. But what about all those other nations? What about the Ugandan tribe that says, you know what? I've heard, this is all I have, but I'm going to follow this God. It's a very profound concept, all because of stories. What's the rest of the chapter for the rest of these guys that are going there? Of course they got dispelled. And then with Theodore Roosevelt, and you guys know the story in 1903, with the Zionist movement, they thought that the Jewish people were going to be moving to Uganda. Can you imagine the happiness in that village when their stories now being built upon, and they're getting excited knowing that the Jews are finally going to be there. And then only in the end to find that their vision is crushed, because guess what? The Jews aren't coming. And for a very good reason, because if they didn't, the land would not be where it is today, and our people would not be in their land. That's the power of a story. The story continues that 7 years later, and I think that was in 1920, the solitary wandering Jew turns up out of nowhere, just shows up, wearing his talit, and finds his way to this Ugandan tribe. And there he taught them more meaningful ways of Torah, more meaningful ways of the Shabbat, of celebrating holidays, spent a couple of months with them, and then left. What a concept of a story, walking that story, having someone from a Jewish background show up with a talit that he left with them. And again, these are real and aspects of stories that are alive and well, which should be transferred down to our children. And he takes all of this and transfers this information to his kids. Later on in many years, as they continue to thrive within that community, as with every other community when you're thriving, the others around, not so happy. And so what do you have? As with the Jews, you have conflicts. And they suddenly try to overpower that tribe and to disseminate them. And in disseminating them, this grandfather of a tribe who died in 1928 of tetanus, took the talit that he was given, cut off the ends, gave them to his 3 sons, and sent them out into the world because that was the only way that they could survive. One of those people ended up via the British into England. And from there, they went to the islands. And for your information, I just want you to know that when Christopher Columbus came over in 1492, that there is a Jewish population that is not only in Jamaica, it's in Cuba, and in other parts of the Caribbean. But these are the stories that you bring, and these are the stories that you carry and you bring to your children. And now we have the format of pictures, and we have the format of artifacts, but telling the story is still something that's very real. Because when one young kid walks into her father's dresser, and at that time they didn't have wardrobes or anything else, or didn't have closets, and you go in and you find a box, and you suddenly find an old letter, or you find bracelets, or you find the end of a piece of a fabric with a blue thread, and you question, what is this? And suddenly your parents begin to tell you this story of where they came from. It becomes even more alive. What's even more interesting is if you, through living social, suddenly decide, I'm going to do a DNA, and you suddenly find out that you too are from Uganda. It's an interesting concept. Stories are important. Stories are important because you tell them to your children. There are many kids that are out there that were given away during the Holocaust that had no idea but heard stories. And suddenly, through one means or the other, they suddenly found themselves and discovered, I am Jewish. Whether by birth or by heart, or I have accepted this. But it's the stories that keep us alive, and it's the stories that keep us connected. And one of the things we wanted to do here today is to make sure that your story is documented. I tell my story to my kid. Now, is all of it actually factual? Yes, I am from Uganda. Yes, a part of me is from Nepal because of that. But there's also the interesting story of there is a tribe in Uganda, and there is a tribe who's practicing Judaism. And at some point, they're at the verge of being accepted by the Orthodox rabbinate in Israel. But this is a story of a people who had absolutely nothing, yet heard a word, accepted that word which we so freely get every single day, and began to live their life. And in living their life, you suddenly had people come to join them. And in joining them and relaying other stories, they've now come to be a thriving community, over 2,000, with a rabbi who was ordained by the conservative movement. And that is what stories are all about. A little bit of fact, a little bit of reality, but nonetheless stories.
Thank you.
Is that the tribe that Rabbi Cameras
Yes.
went to?
Yes,
If anybody's
that
heard
is
of Rabbi Cameras?
Yes, that is the
Assistant rabbi. He was very friendly with the rabbi there. Hi, good afternoon. I'm Isaac Leeser of Philadelphia. I'm here in Baltimore at the invitation of my friends Solomon and Sarah Cavallo. Oh, by the way, maybe some of you know the Cavallos. I know Baltimore's such a small town, everybody knows everybody else. But anyway, I don't know if you know Solomon, you know that he is an amazing person. He is a great photographer and an innovative photographer, and he's an artist. And John Fremont, it must have been about 2 years ago in 1853, John Fremont contacted Solomon personally, asked him to go on his 5th expedition out west, and he wanted Solomon to document it for him. But Solomon and I go back further than that. It was about a little over 10 years ago, in 1845, I officiated at Solomon and Sarah's wedding. And Solomon's also a writer. He contributes to the Occident and American Jewish Advocate. I don't know if anybody gets a subscription to that. It's a wonderful monthly journal. I mean, just because I'm the editor and publisher of it doesn't mean that's not why I'm pushing it. I'm pushing it because it's a great journal. It's filled with opinions, and it has articles about the Jews from the East Coast now all the way to the West Coast. In fact, we even have articles in there about Baltimore, You know, in 45, the first synagogue in Baltimore was built, and we wrote about the dedication to that synagogue. You know, it's Nedcha Yisrael down on Lloyd Street. Now, Sarah, his wife. Sarah and I go back, it's to the middle of the 1830s. We were both living in Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, I was very friendly with Rebecca Gratz, you know, this great educator. And we were talking about our Jewish children. And we were very concerned because they were going to secular school, and the Jewish education was just lacking. So we established the Free Sunday School movement, and Sarah was one of our first teachers. And when she moved to Baltimore, she brought the program with her, and she's teaching here today. Now, let me tell you why, though, they invited me to Baltimore. Solomon and Sarah want to establish a Sephardic congregation here in town. You know, one that follows the Portuguese and Spanish customs. Well, the only synagogues in Baltimore are the Ashkenazic synagogues, but they want a Sephardic one. But you might be thinking, what do Isaac Leeser, I'm a German immigrant, what do I know about the Portuguese customs? Well, let me tell you my story, and I believe you will understand at that point that I am qualified to help them establish a Sephardic congregation. You see, I was 17. The year was 1822. I'm an orphan from Germany. I'm immigrating. I took a ship over from Germany, and I went directly to Richmond, where my mother's brother, Uncle Zalman, lives. He is a respected merchant in the city, and I worked for him in his counting house. But on the weekends were special. I spent them at the synagogue. It was the congregation Beth Shalom in Richmond. It's a Sephardic congregation because, like all the first synagogues in America were Sephardic, and Beth Shalom was one of the first here in this country. Well, I continued my Jewish education through the Chazan there, Chazan Isaac Satius. Oh, by the way, there were no rabbis in America at that point. Well, the Chazans were leading the congregations. In fact, the first rabbi in America is Rabbi Rice. He came to America in 1840, and he's still here in Baltimore. But anyway, so Chazan Satius, he was my teacher, and he taught me so much about Judaism and the Sephardic custom. And he let me teach, and I taught. And I realized that the only way Judaism is going to thrive in this country is through education. It's so important. So meanwhile, after 5 years in Richmond, I heard that another Sephardic congregation, it's in Philadelphia, Mikveh Israel, their Chazan had died. And they're looking for a new Chazan. So I applied for the position. And I was hired. But I started thinking, am I qualified? I'm 22 years old. Do I have the skills? But then I looked at all the other applicants, and I realized I was the most qualified. So I took the job. But you know, in the middle 1820s, the role of the Chazan is to lead services. And if the board allowed him, could officiate at life cycle events. But I wanted more. Now, I heard that some rabbis in Germany were giving sermons in the vernacular, in German, and everybody understood what they were saying. You know, I remember the date. It was June 2nd, 1830. I gave my first sermon from the pulpit in English, and everybody understood what I said. Now, not everybody was happy that I gave a sermon, and it took them about 13 years to accept the fact that that would be a regular occurrence. But my teaching has now started in the congregation. And you know, to teach, you need books that are accessible to your students. Well, in America, there are very few Jewish books in English. Now, when I was in Richmond, I had written a book on the Mosaic laws. I even translated a book from German on the same subject. And I tried to get these books printed. But there was no publisher in America that would take on the task.
So I did the only thing that was available. I became a publisher. One of the books I published was the Siddur. You know, the Siddur was in Hebrew, but many of our people, they don't know their Hebrew that well anymore. So I translated the Siddur from Mikveh Israel into English, and I incorporated the Spanish-Portuguese customs in it. So now our congregants can maybe get a better grasp of the service, I hope. I have a question. When you read the Bible, do you prefer to read it in Hebrew or English? What do you prefer? English, that's what I thought. That's what most of the people I know do. But you know, for a good while in America, the only Bible in English available was a Protestant Bible. It was the King James Version. And I and other Jewish leaders, including Rabbi Rice here in Baltimore, we felt the need for a Bible written through Jewish lenses. So I took on the task. At first I printed the Bible with the first 5 books, you know, the Genesis, Exodus, so the first 5. And then it took me about 10 more years, and I finally translated the entire Bible. And it was just published a few years ago. And out of all the books I've published, and here's a number of them over here on the shelf, this one I'm the most proud of, the Bible that I translated. Now, thank you for listening to me. I'm sorry I have to go now. The Solomon and Sarah are waiting for me. So it's been very nice meeting you this afternoon. Hope you have a good time.
And ladies and gentlemen, that's what we do as members of the museum committee. We have different roles that we play when we're telling stories and we're introducing the timeline. She has superimposed herself as a character, as a person, brought him back to real life, kind of walked you through his life, what he went through, his thoughts, his feelings, and in the end, what he produced that has really helped to grow the Jewish community. Mine, I took a snippet out of history of someone that was abstract, that's somewhere else, yet nonetheless is still a part of Jewish history. And again, still represented in that continent, Africa. So again, you know, there's another part of the history that's back here that brings us up to the current date of where we are. But all the members of our committee pretty much get to do this ever so often. And I'm kind of glad that you guys are here to kind of see and appreciate that. Now my question to you is, what's your story? Is there any one thing that you could pick out of this that you could say, I could create a story out of that? Or maybe there's something that you have that creates a more powerful story for your family. And if you look at this, you know, you'll go, oh, that's a guy, I mean, he's just farming. That's more than just a guy that's farming. That's a guy with a life, with a family that has a history, who was probably an immigrant. We don't know. But he has a story. He has a story. And every one of us here has a story. And the idea of being here is that even though you're not saying it verbally, maybe you have pictures. Maybe you have an artifact. Maybe you have a scarf that was handed down through your family. It's time that we started documenting these thoughts, these ideas, these concepts, the realities of what have happened in our life, package it together so that our kids can have that for their future. Because the stories are the one thing that actually stand out. When you've forgotten everything else, it's the stories that keep you going.
And it's interesting, this is the one that tied me. This is the object that tied me to Isaac Leeser. You know, I've heard about Isaac Leeser through being a docent here. I'm also a docent at the Jewish Museum, and his name has come up. And he's been a very fascinating character, and he's been at the foundation of our American Jewish community. He really has. And then I was going through my grandfather's books, his library. And this is from my grandfather. It's from his brother, given to him. This is Isaac Leeser's translation of the Bible. So there's a, you know, so it's amazing what you can find in your own family.
So does anyone have any one thing, one story, one thing that stands out that could create a story?
Yeah. Well, actually, I was born in Germany and came here before World War II, so there's a whole lot of stuff that I could, well, my children know a lot of it, but I've never actually written it down, which is probably, and I've started doing a little genealogy too, so I should write.
I'm hoping that we're inspiring you to do that. And that if you do have artifacts, again, you know, Chizuk Amuno is a great keeper of all things Jewish.
Right, I had some Hebrew books that I gave to Moshe, some of it, I don't know what he did with them, because when I moved not too long ago, I had to get rid of some stuff, so. But anyway, I'm sure I have stories to tell.
What about you?
Well, similarly, my father's from Greece and a Holocaust survivor, and there's certainly a lot of stories that I realized I need to know better, you know, and we've had this discussion, our whole family was together yesterday, and how we hear the stories, we get tired of the stories, but do we really know the stories well enough? And to be able to then not just read his,
As much as you can remember, because tell your...
My story is that my grandfather came over alone from Europe on his own, and he told me stories for years when I visited. And when I was young, I didn't pay attention. And for life, I can't remember stories now. I only know that he brought, what we figured out was 14 brothers and one sister. He brought them over one at a time from Europe to the United States and sent them out to Pennsylvania. And every so often we find someone with a derivative of our name, which was Davidovich, when he came over. And by the time he left Ellis Island, it was Davis. So we have Davis, Davisons, Davids, Davidsons, all over, Pennsylvania.
But those stories of going through Europe are lost.
Are all lost.
By the way, this is my husband. So that's why
Well, your son is also looking on in interest because, again, those get transferred to him.
I know that both my sets of grandparents came from Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Russia area. And 20 years ago, we had a family reunion of my mother's family. And there was a lot of history and research done and presented. And in 2 weeks is our reunion again. They've found more information, the group that spearheaded it. But it was funny because I have one of the pictures of my grandparents' generation, and I knew only one aunt. They had all predeceased before my generation was born. But I have a watch that was worn by my great-grandmother in the picture. And I was sitting with a cousin, and she went, "Wonder whatever happened to the jewelry?" And I went, "I've got the watch." Now, I'm of the youngest child, so I don't know how it came to my mother. She was actually raised by an older sister because that generation died, but I have that watch that is in that European picture, which is really...
You should take a picture of you.
Oh, I
with
do,
the
I
picture.
have it, I do, I've done that, and it's so interesting. When my son was here at Schechter and they did a family history with Moira Plout, and my son came in with the picture, and she looked at him and she looked at the picture and she said, "That's your face in there." And that was 3 generations back.
right.
And he's carrying, he looks like me, who looks like them, and it's just a wonderful link, I don't know the whole story, but it was fun to hear what I did. My other grandmother spoke no English, and lived with me for 4 years, and read the foreword in Yiddish, and wrote Yiddish letters to this rabbi she met on the boat for years.
No, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And these are her stories.
Downstairs, there is a book open with the registry of the members of the synagogue, and my great-great-grandfather is one of the founders. So from one side of my family, the Blumbergs.
Oh, okay.
Albert Blumberg is
Okay.
my grandmother's side of the family. And so when I was growing up and people would ask, okay, who's in your family? And there was always, I had an uncle in Boston I was supposed to call, and on my father's side, and my mother's side is supposed to be my grandmother, supposed to know everything. And then, this is a lot of years ago when there were only 3 stations, and Roots came on. And I'm watching Roots with my family, and we're watching. We get to the episode at the end where he has to go back to Africa to hear the stories.
Yeah.
And I turned around to my parents and said, I need to find out this information. So I went over and bought a very long roll of brown paper, started off with my first niece, put her name down, and I created a family tree, and everybody on both sides of the family started sending us stuff. We've got things from Ellis Island, we've got all kinds of, that got passed. So there's central depository. You know, it's in my father's, in my father's den. We have all this stuff, and my older sister, who's a IT nerd, she's put the entire thing on computer, so we can actually print the whole thing out.
You go on with it to your great grandfather.
I can go to the late 1800s. I have documentation. Let's go on both sides.
So it took a story to generate your story, and that's what it's all
Yeah.
about.
And, you know, it's interesting, we're standing right here, and does anybody recognize the name of this book?
Shalom.
Shalom Aleichem. Talk storytelling, you know. So I just realized that we're telling stories and
we're right here.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I think storytelling is getting very popular too, the story core and all these
Sure it is.
wonderful things. And sometimes I listen to them, and even though they're very brief, they're just wonderful. Just terrific.
You know, I want to thank you all
Thank
for
you.
coming. One more.